All right. Hi, everybody. It's our CFB Talk. My name is Bobak Kyrie. I'm joined by my regular co host, JD Moore. JD, how are you doing this evening?
We are doing all right tonight. I'm thoroughly pleased right now. I just finished watching the TCU Oklahoma game and absolutely delighted to see that they have brought Hypnotoad in full force to basketball as well. So that Hypnotic Frog now going beyond just the football arena. It's actually now going into all different phases of TCU. I know that they were working on getting some kind of copyright agreement with the Futurama creators, and I am delighted to see that this is now taking a whole life of its own outside of the football program as well.
I just love. Has there been a good story on who came up with the idea of just throwing that on a sweatshirt and watching it take off like that? Because that's one of those marketing stories. It reminds me. It's almost as delightful as the bowl season 2 bowl seasons ago with Easy Post sort of taking the ball and running with it when their bowl got canceled. But this is one of those moments that is just wonderful, kind of oddly organic in its own weird way because no one just no one takes a character from a mainstream cartoon and expects it to take on that kind of a life of its own, but that one absolutely did. Usually well, I mean, maybe it isn't me, maybe it's kind of like the gopher that I mean the dramatic chipmunk that the Minnesota has used now for gosh probably close to a decade. Whenever they have field goals, they throw that meme up on the big board to distract the kicker. But this is definitely one of those that is a delight, and I hope we hear learn more about it because it's such a fun story.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, we've seen a couple of stories now talk about how Hypnotoad kind of took a life of its own, and how, even back in 2015, TCU was doing it in that kind of way with the dramatic chipmunk effect when they would put it up on the big board to kind of distract any type of kicker who was trying to kick a field goal into the north end zone. But the fact that Sonny Dykes had it on an unlicensed sweatshirt, which I think is my favorite part of the entire story, at least everything that I've seen reported and things that I've heard directly from people at TCU, Sonny Dykes never even had like a licensed, approved sweatshirt. He just showed up at practice with one of those, and it's become a whole thing at TCU, and especially to see it now in other sports as well. There's a couple of videos out on Twitter right now of the crowd reacting to one of those insane videos, which of course they also put in one of those crazy meme videos that they've typically been doing after a TCU victory. But they did that in the middle of a game and then ultimately brought Hypnotoad out on the gigantic Jumbotron. Absolutely delightful and chaotic. But to see that.
Yeah, well, every time I Oh, sorry. No, every time I see one of those kind of meme videos, because they've taken off, like the NFL's doing them too. I've always wondered, like, do they have to clear some of that stuff? Because there's a lot of images in those videos, and I'm pretty sure it's somebody with a lot of creative talent just slapping them together. But I've heard some funny stories. I actually heard a story just the other day from someone who worked at one of the major newspaper websites in the Deep South. I'm not going to name the one, but they had done this whole thing. They got Les Miles for an interview. They went to his house. This is between LSU and Kansas. So when he was still doing kind of like little movie clips and movie roles where he's playing like a cop and things like that. So they had, and this never made it to any kind of public. They told me they were disappointed. Never made it to the public because they had him act out all these famous scenes. Like, oh gosh, Silence of the Lambs. They had him play Anthony Hopkins doing the Fava Beans. They had him doing all sorts of movie roles. And then it was a newspaper group. They had sophisticated legal representation, and they were like, "Oh, have we cleared any of this with the copyright holders of these movie scripts?" So they panicked and they didn't release anything. So like, there's apparently a bunch of these recordings of Les Miles doing all of these movie roles and doing things that they were shocked that he was willing to do, and he was even surprised he did them, and then they just never ended up being able to use them. So, and now, of course, the way he ended at Kansas kind of complicated matters, but that's definitely one of those kind of stories that I heard in passing that I absolutely would love to hear more about. So, anyway, as we kind of go into this, there's a lot of stories. If you want to join us, talk about anything in college football, whatever the topic, we're always open to it. Just go ahead and hit request in the bottom left, or wherever they've moved it today, and we'd love to have you join us. But JD, what are some of the stories this week that have got your attention? There's quite a few. I've been paying attention to a few myself, but I'd love to hear what is getting your attention in college football this week.
I think one of the things that's immediately catching my attention is the fact that Nick Saban currently has to hire two new coordinators. So Bill O'Brien going off back to New England as an offensive coordinator to go work with the Patriots once again. We already saw Pete Golding. He had left as the defensive coordinator to go join Lane Kiffin over at Ole Miss. So now, for the first time in a while, we've seen Nick Saban kind of have a clean slate to pick out a pair of assistants to be his new coordinators. And I have just been cackling at some of the ideas of, who we could possibly see as if Nick Saban wanted to go on the most absolute difficult level, who are the two worst guys he could try to pick up. And I think the common answers commonly seem to be some kind of variation of like a Brian Ferentz as an offensive
Oh my
coordinator
gosh.
or other just delightful nonsense like that. But I think still in the same vein, I'm thoroughly curious to see who these picks are going to be. I think Jeremy Pruitt, that seems to be a name thrown out a lot to bring him back as a defensive coordinator. Seems like a possibility to be offensive coordinator. You've got a lot of options there as well. I've seen a couple of people thinking, like Cliff Kingsbury, if he was going to take one job in college and actually leave the beaches of Thailand, it might be for the Nick Saban school of coaches who can't coach good. But the fact that he's got both of these coordinator roles open relatively late in the coaching cycle, I think it's going to be two fascinating hires of who Alabama picks next.
Absolutely. If anything, I'd be worried if I'm another coach, only because he can afford to pay a lot of money, and a lot of people would be willing to take that role if for a few years, knowing that you can bounce to something lucrative like a head coaching job or being an NFL coordinator quite easily. So, yeah, I'd be curious to see. I think that is one of the more intriguing twists to this early off season. Another story that I found fascinating is the whole Ed Reed saga. I mean, this has been just a disaster for Bethune-Cookman. I mean, they make a big splash. They hire, a high profile, uh, you know, FBS Miami, but also, pro great, somebody who's outgoing, who is, I mean, it's hard not to see the Deion Sanders effect happening here because Ed Reed is a character. He was interesting. And then things just go off the rails so quickly. He makes a pair. I mean, for those of you who are probably familiar or may not be, Ed Reed takes a job at Bethune Cookman. He, I guess, in principle, agreed to be the head coach, and we'll get to that in a second, in December, and then starts going there and starts making videos, social media videos, being very honest. I mean, the guy's videos are actually excellent because you can tell they're coming from somewhere passionate, somewhere raw. And he's saying, the struggle at these programs is real, kind of echoing what some of the things that Deion Sanders said early on at Jackson State. But then he made a video that he was basically talking about how disappointed he was in the school and how his players were cleaning up a field. It was implied a practice field. Some of it, I've heard a couple of variations on that, whether it was a practice field or not, and how his office hadn't been cleaned before he got there, and railing on it. And then next thing you know, you hear that Bethune-Cookman has refused to ratify his contract, so he's not the head coach. And this has been kind of a bit of a stretch for Bethune-Cookman. The school, as we've talked about in previous shows, moved with Florida A&M down to, they went from the MEAC to SWAC. Florida A&M's done fine. Bethune-Cookman struggle. They've had a lot of administrative issues. So this seemed like an opportunity to turn them around. And it blew up in spectacular fashion. I mean, this is just because Ed Reed didn't need the money. He didn't need the fame. This was going to be his first head coaching position on a major basis because he coached, actually, coincidentally, coached a high school all-star game against Deion Sanders back in the day. But this was going to be his position, and I have never seen anything blow up like that. I know some of his Instagram live feed where he told the players he's no longer going to be their head coach. I mean, he's just talking about like I'm walking amongst Judas as he's telling them why he's leaving, and it is just was just one of the more spectacular blowups I've ever seen. And I don't know, that story has been, along with what's going on in Alabama, have been two of the bigger ones I'd say this offseason for sure. Let me see here.
Yeah, I think one of the other things as well that I think is just fascinating with the Ed Reed saga is we saw an incredible amount of success and a quick turnaround with Deion Sanders at Jackson State. He brought them a lot of notoriety. He brought them a lot of new opportunity that they had never really truly had before, at least in modern college football times. It kind of seemed like Bethune Cookman wanted to kind of splash in on that, but then the fact that it fell apart that quickly, I think it's just absolutely surprising to see not just a school try to emulate kind of that similar big splash, but to see it go catastrophically wrong. I mean, this is probably what you got to go back, probably back to like the Price era at Alabama for something to go like that disastrously and end that quickly before you actually have a game even start.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. That's probably one of the more comparable instance, or, still old enough to remember oh gosh, oh my gosh, Notre Dame. What was the coach? The UCL, the guy
George
who ended up
O'Leary.
making it. George O'Leary, Georgia Tech, successful, goes to Notre Dame. Finds out he lied about some of his educational background on at back when he was a student. I think it was at Maine, and then next thing you know, he's at UCF and eventually turns them around. But yeah, sometimes these things have twists and turns. So again, if you'd like to join our conversation, we'd love to talk to you. And whatever you want to talk about in college football, just hit request. We'll let you up, and we'll have you as part of this conversation. But JD, another thing that's been kind of striking to me is looking at the non-conference schedule games. I got kind of interested of them, looked at, especially now that some of the regular season schedules are starting to be announced. And I'm thinking, one game that I'm really looking forward to, only because those are two teams that have had kind of a rough season in 2022 and are going to be testing themselves fairly early, is the Texas A&M at Miami game, because those are two teams that had similar problems. Although arguably Texas A&M is certainly got more going on, at least in terms of financial wherewithal, than Miami. But these are two programs that just had disastrous 2022 seasons, relatively speaking. Um, I'm looking forward to that game just to see how it turns out. What games are you looking forward to heading into this early season?
Well, again, I think just going off some of the storylines, I think that Miami Texas A&M game is going to kind of be your very strongly circled which fan base panics most at the start of the year, because either way, I mean, we saw Texas A&M and Miami. That was a game that should have been college game day. It should have been a gigantic triumph in College Station. But then we saw Texas A&M stumble to Appalachian State, who quite literally stole college game day from them. And then we saw Miami stumble down the line. They had the embarrassing loss to Middle Tennessee State, blown out by Florida State. And for two programs that have spent so much money into making sure that their teams are supposed to be able to compete, not just for their conference, but to try to be in the national championship hunt, to see that game kind of turn into nothing from this last season, and to see the amount of stress that is in both of those programs, I think that's going to be a huge game in the way that we kind of saw Nebraska Northwestern this year of, if you lose this game, it's time for you to start panicking. So that's absolutely high up there on my list for, a game that's going to be fascinating for the 2023 non-conference slate. But one of the games that I think is just going to be a sneaky good game, just looking at the schedule ahead, you're going to have to look into, I believe it's week 2. You're going to be looking in Lubbock for an incredible game of the Oregon Ducks traveling to Lubbock to play the Texas Tech Red Raiders. You got Joey McGuire, who has brought the first winning conference record to Texas Tech for the first time since 2009. You've got the Oregon Ducks, who, under Dan Lanning, they've got a lot of hope of what the program can be, what it's going to do in the next year, what it's going to do in the future. And you've got a Pac-12 that's really resurgent. You had Washington with an incredible year, UCLA, USC with some incredible regular seasons, Utah ended up winning the championship in that conference as well. Where does Oregon stack up on that? And especially going on a weird road trip for a program like Oregon, I am fascinated with that game as a non-conference game.
Yeah, if they can get past Texas Tech, I think they have a good, strong chance of opening 5-0 before they go to Washington, because other teams, they open with Portland State. That should be pretty straightforward. Hawaii is still Hawaii. Colorado is going to be still getting used. I mean, Colorado and Stanford both have new head coaches. And then it's going to be that October 14th at Washington that will probably be the beginning of the real challenge session for them. But we have someone up here who'd like to join the conversation. Ice Devil of Carlsbad, what's going on?
Hey, how you guys doing?
Good.
Good. Hey, I was going to shift the topic just a little bit. Was curious to get your thoughts on with the expansion of the playoff and the increasing size of the conferences. Conference championship week, to me, it just if it's done in the same way, it just doesn't make as much sense when the playoff field is expanded. I was wondering if we might utilize that conference championship week more for play-in games, second place, third place teams, maybe even some out of conference games for positioning there, and give those conference champions from the regular season a bye. It just doesn't make sense. I could see a lot of situations in a big conference like Big Ten, SEC, where the number one team would be better off resting its players.
Well, first and foremost, it's a fantastic question. And I think one of the reasons that I've loved this 12 system format in the way that they've put it together with the top four teams.
Your audio went a little bit wonky there for a second. So
all right. You got me on this one?
Set that back up, unless hopefully it's not like last week where my audio, I was not hearing anyone and talking over people.
All right. You got me on this one now?
JD, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, while I'm solving that, he can hear me. Great, that's cool. I'll kind of give an initial answer to that too, because that was a good question. I am personally looking forward to seeing how this plays out. I mean, they're still important in that obviously the main conference champions are probably all going to be in. I'm not too concerned about the value of that, but I think there's going to be some edge. There's some edge cases that are going to be playing for an opportunity to not only go in, but also be in at large. And I'm sorry, I'm reading up something, and have to be a conference champion to be a top 4 seed per the Pac-12. Oh, the 12-team format. Yeah. Hey, JD, do you want to try and unmute? I want to let you kind of get back up here because that was kind of a weird hiccup.
Yeah. Can you hear me now on this one?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool. Y'all can hear me. I'm good on that. So, all right, let's go ahead and get back into this. So, one of the big things, again, for what's going to happen with this 12-team format is you're going to have to be a conference champion in order to be a top 4 seed and get that first week bye. That's already in the bylaws right now for this conference championship and for this playoff format that we're going to be seeing down the road here, whether it starts in 2024, 2025, whenever that kicks off, that's what's already been agreed to. So if we had an example for this year, like, yes, everybody was saying, Georgia would have been the clear number 1. You would have had Michigan as the very clear number 2. TCU would not have gotten a bye because they wouldn't have been a conference champion. You wouldn't have had Ohio State getting a bye or being a 4 seed because they were not a conference champion. You would have had a combination of Kansas State, Clemson, Utah, all putting in for a fight to get those other top 2 seeds to get a bye. And then, man, what a wild playoff that turns into. Because then you would have something along the lines of a Tulane TCU or a Clemson versus Ohio State. You get those types of excellent games that happened before that. And that's what makes that conference championship so incredible. Because if you look at it this way, Kansas State goes into playing against TCU. Yes, they're playing for a Big 12 championship. It'd be the first time in roughly about 12 years, first time to do it outside of Bill Snyder. That's an incredible story for Kansas State. But for a national parlay, they're playing for a first-round bye. That's a huge play-in as opposed to going to, hey, we'll play in a Sugar Bowl. Hey, we'll play in a nice bowl game. Hey, we'll have a nice little thing that'll cap off this season. They're actually playing for huge ramifications in this playoff system. It's going to be a similar thing with Clemson. It's a similar thing when we had USC and Utah. Imagine Utah playing in that game because we already had a system where if USC won that game, USC goes to the playoff in the current system. If Utah won that game, they might be that outside shot to get that extra seed. And that's why I think the conference championship games, that's why they don't want their guys to rest, because, if you're in Alabama or if you're Michigan or you're anybody else who wants to just go, I'm just going to pull my guys, let them rest for the playoffs. You don't want that, because you want that bye to begin with.
I understand that. I wonder if these conferences could crown their champion from the regular season schedule, just like there's a few in the basketball world that do that, like the Ivy League, I believe, does. And then instead of having Kansas State play TCU for the Big 12 champ, is you say, well, TCU earned the championship in the regular season, and then have some play-in games, like maybe Kansas State plays Alabama for one of those seeds or something like that. I think you can make conference championship week go from some meaningful games to just a whole collection of really appealing games.
That is a really interesting idea. My only thought on that is the amount of vested interests that there are in staging conference title games as they are, and the amount of money at stake. I think that said, we have certainly seen the pandemic had those wild situations where games were being set up at the last second, and even the bowl season of 2021, 2022, we saw some, the Arizona Bowl get poached really quickly to keep the Sun Bowl alive. So sometimes things can happen on short notice. But I think the conference title games are just such an important part of the ecosystem for them. And I'm sure they're big money makers for the conferences in and of themselves to help them maintain, their own operating expenses and all of that stuff. I think it's an intriguing idea, but it is also hard to set those things up on the last second, especially with the caliber of teams we're talking about too. I mean,
well, then if it stays within the conference, then you take a look at the Big Ten example. You say, all right, well, Michigan won it outright, so they're our champion, and let's take a look at Ohio State and Penn State and see who might be more deserving of that runner up. I mean, and really, there's nothing stopping those big conferences as they go to 14 teams, 16 teams to have two games. You could take the next two from the Big Ten forward to see if those winners would be deserving of a bid. I just think it'd be more meaningful football overall than seeing Georgia play. Well, as the field expands to 12, I mean, Georgia versus anyone, yes, they get that first round bye, which is important, but you're really making, most likely in the SEC, the number one, number two teams are going to be in automatically anyway. So that conference championship week it's just going to have a weird feeling, I think, once we get to that point.
One thing I will say, your idea from a purely pragmatic standpoint in terms of getting the most conference teams in, I think makes sense. Like, certainly if you have a conference winner in like the SEC, they're probably going to get in no matter what. Why not just have the second and third place team, or the two teams that seem on the bubble of getting into the playoffs, simply play each other and then get one of them in? But at the same time, I think there's a lot of reasons. Like, it would be a pretty big paradigm shift to get the conferences to go away from a title game, although without entirely eliminating it. Although, gosh, I mean, all it takes is one conference to try something like that, make it work, and then suddenly it becomes in vogue. I just think the threshold for that is pretty steep, but it's certainly one of the more unique ideas I've heard for a way to try and turn things in the way we think of college football to benefit getting more teams, at least from a certain conference, into that 12-team playoff. But it'll be interesting. I'm really curious to see how the first year goes, because I think the first year or two is when we're going to see how people react to it. And to be fair, maybe by year 2 or 3, I'd be curious to see how the ratings go as well, because everyone's going to tune in, I think, the first year just to see a lot more of these games, the novelty of it. I think certainly when we saw how the initial CFP games went, there was a huge amount of interest. And then they stayed pretty high. There was a little bit of a drop here or there, but they stayed. I think most of the drop was the next year they tried to shoehorn some of those games into like the New Year's Eve spot, like a little too late in the evening. Not even like some of them were, and I mean, to an extent we had a little bit about this year, but I think it was just too soon to try something that bold. But I'd be curious to see how things look by year 2 and year 3 of the 12-team playoff, just to see how that goes. JD, what do you think of the 12-team playoff? What are your thoughts on it right now? I mean, what are some of the things that have intrigued you that we don't necessarily talk about beyond the fact that it's going to be more inclusive?
I mean, I think one thing that's not hyped up enough is the fact that for this first round, you're going to have on campus games the way that college football should be played. I still just love the idea of just looking into the future, just a wacky situation of something going along the lines of a number 8 Wisconsin having to host a number 9 Florida in the middle of December during a gigantic Wisconsin blizzard. I love concepts like that where you're going to have crazy opportunities for cold weather, for windy weather, for insane weather, and to kind of just get games in places that you don't see anywhere else. I mean, if we talk about the non-conference games that are coming up, we're seeing these wild games like Oregon going to Texas Tech, or, another example would be Florida going over into Utah to double back on that home to home. And that's the first time they've gone that far west in a very, very, very long time. And to know that you have games that will have that type of possibility, and you have games where, if you're even playing for, you're not going to get one of those first 4 buys, but you're playing for the difference between 7th and 9th place, meaning you get to play for revenue for a home game that you get to keep. That keeps games so much more interesting late in the year because, again, if we've got 12 teams, you're not just going to be looking at these conference championship games and how things are going to settle up there. You're going to start watching games like the Apple Cup, like with Washington and Washington State, because Washington, they could have had a very solid shot of trying to sneak in as a 12 seed or even higher. And if you have games like that, that's going to affect, who's an 8 seed versus who's a 9 seed in the polling. That makes these late games so much more intriguing at every single level of the sport. It goes beyond just, who's your Alabamas, who's your Georgias, who's your Ohio States and Michigans, like who's going to go into these championships. Suddenly you have all these side games of, wait a second, what happens in this scenario, which just makes the games so much more fun.
Man, I totally forgot for a second about that Utah return trip for Florida to play in Rice Eccles. I am looking forward to that, but also Utah has that, and then they play at Baylor. So that trio of teams is going to really sort itself out. And those are all teams because Utah's losing a couple of key players heading into this season. But they're still Utah. You still can't count them out. And gosh knows Cal Whittingham knows how to get them to play beyond their talent level. But to see them host Florida and then go to Baylor against a team that again kind of disappointed last season, but it's still a team that people think have a good chance with Aranda and all of that. I'm very curious to see how they do in their first 2 games and how to see how those 2 teams that their opponents do as well. And then they have Weber State, which would be straightforward before they jump into Pac-12 play, because of course the Pac-12 still only has 3 non-conference games, so there's very little opportunity for some of these matchups that make the sport so interesting. I mean, USC's always got one of them locked away for Notre Dame, so it's really they only get 2 chances, and they've got, I think, was it San Jose State and Nevada, so that's not going to be that much of a challenge for USC. That actually makes sense, though, if you know anything about the way USC does its scheduling. I've talked about it before. When they play at Notre Dame, they make sure they have 2 fairly straightforward, easy home games, or if they've got a big P5 opponent, they make sure the home game is on the same day year that they're playing at Notre Dame. But this is a comparatively easy schedule for the Trojans this upcoming season, so that actually looks good for them. Let's see, again, if you'd like to, we're coming in at about half hour into our Thursday night show. If you'd like to join us, we always love hearing from you. Just go ahead and hit request. We'll let you up and hear whatever you'd like to talk about in college football. There's so many topics out there. One of the other games that's going to be interesting only because, and it's funny too, because I mean, TCU should be favored against Colorado, but the fact is Colorado is going to come in with that game, which would have, I think, otherwise been ignored. It's going to be intriguing for so many reasons. I believe, is it the opener for both programs?
Yes,
Help me
yes,
there,
it
JD.
is. So Colorado and TCU will be dueling at Fort Worth in week 1. It will be the debut of Deion Sanders at a Power 5 school. It'll be the first game for TCU post national championship appearance. And I think it's going to be one of those games where I wouldn't be surprised if Colorado pulls off a big surprise over TCU, because one of the big things for TCU is they're losing so much production from this team. They've lost Quentin Johnson. They've lost Max Duggan. They've lost several offensive linemen. They've lost all these guys who were so critical to this very senior heavy team for TCU this last year. And I think it's going to be one of those teams where that production, you can't necessarily bring that back in 1 year. And I think for what's going to happen for that game, it could very easily be a hangover game. It could very easily be a, hey, we're still trying to fix out the kinks. You got to remember, at least in this last year when Colorado and TCU played, you had a game where less than 100 yards of offense was performed by TCU in that first half, next to no points until they finally opened it up in the second half. So the fact that we're going to have that as an opener, I think it's a very easy opportunity to overreact to however Deion Sanders performs at Colorado. Because if you go, hey, he just went down to Fort Worth and he won a game against a team that made the national championship game, we should rank Colorado. I could very easily see that hype train going up and then suddenly crashing down as they start to play against other teams. I think it'll be a fun game to watch. I plan to be at that game, but I don't necessarily see that as a referendum per se for either program. At least in week 1, though, I think one of the other ones that I think is also going to be fascinating is, we talk about these games that are going to be returning to different home atmospheres. Man, LSU and Florida State Part 2 on another Sunday game, but this time in Orlando, Florida, instead of playing in the Superdome like they did last year. Let's talk about, again, how that insane game on a non-Saturday night opened up week 1 of this last season with mixed extra points, just general tomfoolery throughout the game, put FSU on a fantastic track. They ended up having a really nice, successful season. LSU, they were able to make it back after they beat Alabama, made it to the SEC championship. But it was one of those wild and wacky games that now we get a sequel to that in another semi-neutral site game. That's going to be a lot of fireworks in week 1, and it might end up taking the show once again.
I agree with you. I'm actually really looking forward to that game. I'm glad it gets to be all by itself. I think this year we're going to be seeing if Florida State, because I think they definitely had a great season last year. I mean, both teams really did, but I think it's going to be fun to see which of the two programs really runs with that and has a nice bounce off of it, and I think will be an early kind of darling in all of the in college football. Gosh, JD, you just pointed out another game. The is that is that UCLA Coastal? Is that happening in
again,
week 1?
if we're going to be talking about games that are just
wild
and away games you don't expect, Coastal Carolina opening up at Chip Kelly's UCLA next year in the Rose Bowl. Man, talk about a long flight going from one coast to the other, especially to see how they're going to perform post Jamie Chadwell, but still having Grayson McCall as a quarterback. And then for UCLA to have their new quarterback that they're breaking in, that's going to be a weird game, and I'm looking forward to that one as well.
UCLA is kind of for UCLA fans, a very interesting kind of non-conference slate because they have that Coastal Carolina game. They're heading down to San Diego State the next week to play at Snapdragon Stadium, which, other than the fact that that unfortunate debut where they hosted their first home game with Arizona, and it was the hottest game in the history of that program, and the stadium had not been designed for that. It had been designed for more evening games in San Diego weather. I've heard, other than that, it's actually a really nice venue. So Snapdragon Stadium, which also has one of the best names in college football, that should be a fun game for UCLA. And then they break their streak of never playing FCS in the best way possible. They're hosting North Carolina Central. So they've actually got a pair of money games. They got Coastal Carolina and they got North Carolina Central. But that should be good. That should be a nice game for for a lot of reasons. And it's going to be an exciting atmosphere in the Rose Bowl. And hopefully the fans start to come because they weren't bad last year. I still think UCLA is a narcoleptic giant in a lot of ways. I mean, when they want to be good, well, I won't say they're narcoleptic. They can actually be quite good. They've had years. I still remember '98, but man, that's going to be an intriguing game in and of itself. Um, Goodness, and going back to Colorado for a second, I am really intrigued. Your idea of them suddenly upsetting TCU, because you're right, it could happen. TCU loses key talent, and then suddenly, the Dion effect does that start to get. I don't know if they get ranked, but they certainly get attention. But if they then get two of their blood rivals, like their worst rivals, I mean, they've got as non-conference games because they have Nebraska, which, as I've said before, if you know anything about Nebraska, they're super nice fans. If you've ever been to the stadium, I've had the opportunity. They're really nice to opposing fans. They clap for the opposing team. But when you walk around the tailgates, you realize there's one team they genuinely hate at Nebraska, and it's mutual. That's Colorado. So they're renewing that rivalry. And then, of course, the Rocky Mountain Showdown finally comes back. So they get Colorado State, which will be good in and of itself because Colorado State was hell of a disappointing team last year. I know it was a first-year program, I mean, at least for the head coach, Jay Norvell, but they poached him from Nevada for a reason, and he just did not meet expectations last season. So there's going to be a lot of intrigue for Colorado's first three games, even if Deion Sanders wasn't already there. There was going to be intrigue for that program, which, again, that's a program where it's striking to me that I remember reading that, in the late 90s and even the early aughts, it was like they were one of the top three programs with NFL talent that was playing right there as well. Oh, and JD, you have a couple of other games you wanted to bring up there too. And again, if you want to join a conversation about this or any other topic, just hit request. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, sure. Again, as we're going through kind of the preview of 2023 for the non-conference slate, again, we're in the off season. We can talk narratives. We can talk changes that are going to happen over the course of this off season. But looking into that first couple of games in week 0, week 1, kind of those narrative changing games, those kind of weird games of how on earth did that game get scheduled? One of the things that I think is curious on there is a pair of games of Power 5 teams going off and playing at G5 schools. One of them is Oregon State playing at San Jose State. And then you've also got Texas Tech playing at Wyoming in week 1 as well. I'm fascinated with those two pair of games where you've got Power 5 games where they're not necessarily teams that are the first brand in their state, and they're not necessarily, the name brand, but, you've got DJ making his debut at quarterback at Oregon State, but they're playing that game at San Jose State, and then Texas Tech going up to Craig Bowl, playing at high altitude. That's going to be a fun game to watch. But I think one other game that I think is also going to be really, really intriguing is you get to reopen the Chris Peterson Bowl. Boise State goes to Washington to play the Huskies in week 1. Boise State in a very strange year where they really were able to dominate the Mountain West until the championship game when they fell to Fresno State. They had a very weird out-of-conference schedule where they were dropping games to UTEP. Then they had their bowl appearance to cap off a very strange year overall. They go up against Washington, where for them, if Washington didn't lose to Arizona State last year, they would have been that team that USC would have been playing against for probably a playoff appearance. If you had a pair of one-loss teams in the Pac-12 in the situation that we had this last playoff system. But Kalen DeBoer is building something out there in Seattle, and I think it's going to be a different momentum change if he can build on the Alamo Bowl with a win over Texas, and you got Boise State coming in as a regional rival. It's a game that means a lot to people in the Pacific Northwest, and especially if we see something along the lines of Andy Alvios is able to pull off an upset out there and kind of rebuild what Boise State was known for in their tough out of schedule conferencing. If they're able to kind of show that they can do work outside of the Mountain West and kind of try to bring some kind of glory back to the Mountain West, that's going to be a really, really fun game in week 1 that I think kind of will set a little bit of a tone for both programs as well.
Gosh, there's a couple of things you got me thinking about. First of all, if USC had somehow won the Pac-12 championship, let's say Caleb Williams didn't get injured early or they had an opponent that was in Utah. I just thought not that USC was going to go that far. I was like, they would have been the 4 seed. Georgia would have probably done to USC what they did to TCU, and then TCU would have still assumably played Michigan and made it through, and then they would have done exactly what they did to TCU again, and Georgia would have looked even more terrifying because it would have been like 250-point wins in a row in the playoff if USC had made it through. And I say this as a Trojan fan. I think that's exactly what would have happened. It would have been, oh my gosh. But, there's so much kind of intrigue there. The Beavers have always been willing to play home and homes. I was actually, I looked it up. I was wondering if it was a 2-for-1 where San Jose State agreed to play it in Corvallis twice for Oregon State to come down, but it's just a straight home and home. I think part of that is the benefit of some of these Mountain West programs, not all of them. Obviously, Boise State and Wyoming don't quite fit into this, but they've got very good, home situations for recruiting because the Bay Area still has athletes. And San Diego State's the other example of that. People are willing to go play in San Diego State. And now UNLV finally has a stadium that makes programs willing to go down to Vegas to play because you please all your alumni. I mean, it's a away game in Vegas. It's like playing at Hawaii. You're doing it not only for your team, you're doing it because your alumni all get to have a opportunity, at least the more moneyed alumni who would like to go on a trip to Hawaii, get that excuse. But goodness, another thing too, and one of the intrigue aspects of the Mountain West is, of course, the only commissioner they've ever had has just retired. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Mountain West does in the future, in the near future, under new leadership, because that's actually, I think, one of the angles that is going to be interesting. Because Craig Thompson, again, he's been with the conference for, again, since it started in '98, so for 24 years. So now we're going to have Gloria Nevarez, who actually just started. Pardon me, I forgot she started in January. So it's a new time for the Mountain West, and we're going to see how she does in getting them competitive again. So yeah, again, if you'd like to join our conversation, we always love having you all up here. Just hit request. We've got at least 15 more minutes. We'd like to fill our time quite well with all of this. We've been talking about all kinds of topics. I mean, anything in college football is fair game. One of the things I know that's been a topic is just a lot of folks just like to talk about Texas A&M. I'm looking at what's popular in our CFB right now and what's popular in conversations. I mean, Bruce Feldman noted that Texas A&M has lost 25 scholarship players in one offseason. 18 were blue chip recruits. 8 were top 100 recruits, including 5-star Denver Harris and Chris Marshall. 7 were freshmen from their top-ranked 2022 recruiting class. It's easy to critique that. It's kind of a fascinating dynamic that we're seeing in college football. Certainly, did some of them get the money that was supposedly thrown at that class? I'm not sure. There is some. I'm waiting to see a nice, ugly lawsuit. I think that's what we kind of want to see, to have the shroud pulled away from what's going on in some of these NIL deals. Because certainly, I mean, it's been talked to death. What's been happening at Florida? Was it really $13 million? What was the arrangement that they were trying to use? I've seen that number bandied about a lot. Meanwhile, we're seeing in things like basketball, there was this whole feature in the New York Times magazine that hit their website today. I think it's going to be featured this weekend in the printed edition if you're still a person who picks up a printed newspaper. But I mean, listening to how they're able to keep that successful team together in hoops with all these NIL deals. But I mean, a lot of that's changed the game. And looking at what's going on in Texas A&M, I mean, some of the fans, they see that and they say, well, good for the players to get their bag. I think I think Ewers really got everyone's attention when he took that money and then left Ohio State to go to Texas. That was definitely one of those moments. But certainly, what's going on at A&M has been part of that. I think if they start winning again, a lot of that will go away. This is going to be an interesting season for them. I know we were talking about it earlier. Seeing how that game with Miami goes will set an interesting tone, given last year's games seemed to be exciting for what was going on at A&M, but they had so many both programs that had their own disastrous seasons. So this will be a great opportunity. I mean, Texas A&M, they have a pretty easy game with New Mexico to open up. They go to Miami. Should hopefully be an interesting game. Good game, I don't know, but it'll definitely have the drama. Then they got Louisiana Monroe before they jump into SEC play. Again, another topic that has been of interest in college football this week has been just sort of also looking at, a lot of these moves in some of the and one thing I did want to mention, and I know JD's had to step away from the mic for a bit, but I one of the stories in all of this NIL that I found absolutely delightful is the Popeyes student, the Popeyes meme kid, finally getting his bag, finally getting some money because I don't know if you've caught this story. I'm sure most of you have, but the kid from the Popeyes meme, the one that was the young kid, with his Popeyes cup, looking like, "Why are you filming me?" In fact, I didn't even know it was Popeyes. It was just a young kid, a little heavy set, little husky, looking a little awkward under the camera. Well, that young man has grown up to be a 300-pound offensive lineman. He plays in D2 for Lake Erie. I think they're Lake Erie football. And folks notice that he is on a team. So thankfully, Twitter took the ball and ran with it. Reddit did too, but I'd like to think Twitter probably had a little more impact, and Popeyes have made him one of their NIL deals, which I think is absolutely a delight. We're trying to figure out how much he's getting. Is that the biggest NIL deal for a D2 player? Might be. I'm not sure. I mean, I hope they gave him some kind of like gold card or something to let him walk into any Popeyes in America and get all the money he wants. I think the estimate is, and here's the funny thing. There's like the current numbers, there's roughly 520,000 NCAA athletes at any given time. I mean, over 500,000 NCAA athletes. Probably 1,000 or so are getting NIL deals of any substance right now, to be realistic with all of it, because that includes all levels. That includes, D2, D3. But I know, JD, you wanted to talk a little bit about that. Oh, actually, and we've got someone else in the queue. We've actually got a couple of people in the queue. Let's get you guys up here. We'd love to have more voices on this and just us talking. Let's see. Triple option is king. You were up first. Would love to hear from you.
What's up, fellas? So, kind of want to just kind of chit chat with you guys about the whole Trajan Jeffcoat saga, if y'all been following that closely at all. But we just got another update tonight that supposedly, even though he's committed to Arkansas, that South Carolina is still in it, since he won't be able to start classes until the summer. As crazy as that sounds. So it gets even crazier, an already crazy saga.
Ooh, I like hearing about this. Tell us more about it for those who aren't familiar, including myself.
Okay, so
be careful.
I'm going to tell the honest truth as I know it. So hand on the Bible for this one, fellas. So buckle up. So basically, Trajan Jeffcoat from Missouri, he's a defensive end of Missouri. He was a first-team All-SEC 2 years ago. And good football player, hit the transfer portal. Is from South Carolina, went to Irmo High School, which is the same high school as Nicky Mawari, who's one of South Carolina's best players. So a local high school in Columbia. And a lot of the fan base, me included, thought that he should have been a take out of high school when Will Muschamp was coaching. Wasn't the case. So basically what happens is Shane Beamer sends out welcome home tweets, which is the commitment tweet for South Carolina football. And he sends one out referring to Trajan Jeffcoat, and everyone in the fan base that's like in the know that pays attention to it is talking about it. And, everything's looking good. Jeffcoat is enrolled. He's in the email system. So, like, you typed his name in. Trajan Jeffcoat comes up. He's a student. He's admitted to the University of South Carolina. But, boom, something happens where he can't be admitted, where he can't register for classes. And this all stems back to an issue in 2019 at Missouri where he was thrown off the team. Now, the details of him being thrown off the team are not clear, and there's a lot of rumor, which I'm not going to spread, but if you look for it, you'll find it. So there's about that, a bunch of rumors about that. But basically now he's committed to Arkansas, which basically proves that it's not the SEC transfer rule, which is like if you commit some offense at one university, you can't transfer to another SEC university, which is like, I don't know, it has a name for it, like maybe the Jeremy Musa rule or something like that. But you'll find it on the Reddit. I'm sure someone's talked about it before. But basically, he's now committed to Arkansas, which proves that it's not an SEC issue. It's something that's South Carolina's issue. So basically, the University of South Carolina refused to admit Trajan Jeffcoat even though he was admitted, which is crazy, to actually enrolling at the university, which has been a huge saga for South Carolina fans. And if you look anywhere on our message boards, whether it be the 247 or On3 or Rivals, anywhere you look, it's the only thing people are talking about. And it has been that way for most of the last 2 weeks.
Oh, this is classic drama. Yeah, I'm looking at also some of the things on Twitter and such. So this is classic stuff. This is like, what is it? Why couldn't he get in? And now people have to kind of make all kinds of wild rumors. I'm not necessarily gonna. Yeah, I agree. It's like I'm always
Like
careful
if you look it up, you'll see the rumors. I'm just not gonna push them on.
Yeah, no. But all of this stuff is great because this is the kind of stuff that makes off season so fun, especially for it. So you got a guy who's good, who should have, and I see
especially
exactly
with
what
us losing Jordan Birch, he would have been a day one starter. And it's like a hometown guy coming home, which is what fans always want. You know, like you always want your local guys to play at your local school, especially when they prove themselves at other schools.
You know, Gamecock AP, you've been also up here. I want to hear your 2 cents on this because I know you've clearly got your thoughts on it as well.
So I'm in a extremely similar boat. TOK and I we're buddies anyway, so
yeah, we're good friends.
We already we knock heads in terms of like what's going on at this point. But yeah, we're in very similar boats in terms of the situation. Well, I also don't want to comment in terms of what he's saying in regards to what actually happened. Like that's a touchy subject. I think you guys know where that's heading. But in terms of the University of South Carolina, if he can turn around and go 2 days later to the University of Arkansas, I have a real issue with that. And that's kind of where I am as in personal, like as a personal standpoint. I know there's some others that are going to feel differently, but there's nothing that's been proven at all to deny him from the University of South Carolina. So that's where I have a real issue.
Yeah,
you know, it almost. I was actually going to ask: is Arkansas like the Arizona State of the SEC in terms of like if it's an academic issue?
That's never been a thing before. No, like we know it's not an academic issue.
He was in all honor roll. He was on the SEC honor roll.
Gotcha.
So it's not academic.
Gotcha. Yeah, no. It's just because that's when you see people talk about credits or things like that.
And CFB, like, we're South Carolina, not Vanderbilt. You know,
you don't need a 4.0 to get in here. You know.
Well, there's been famous moments like Vontaze Burfict. I mean, he was a hell of a linebacker, but he couldn't get into USC, and he famously couldn't. And then he ends up at Arizona State and just tears everything up. And he wasn't like. He wasn't. I'm not saying he was like completely like academically invalid or anything like that, but it just like that was a classic moment where I know before all of this happened, he was one of those guys that just sort of like he couldn't get into a prime school and he got into a solid school and then got himself in the NFL. Yeah, we have another Gamecock fan up here, I think, or might not be a Gamecock fan.
No, yeah, Dakota is. Yeah.
What's up, Dakota? Do you want to let me hear your thoughts on this topic?
I'm sort of the same boat as them, but I have more info, and it's been confirmed by a family member. So you want me to spill it, I will. If not, it's all cool. It's up to y'all.
I can confirm what he's about to say is accurate.
A family member did verify what he has to say.
Is on Famously Garnet Sports Twitter page and Facebook. If you want to go there and look at it, they're great with the stuff. But it's all up to y'all. If you want me to spill it, I will. I have no problem. Family member has no problem. He wants the truth out there, so it's all up to y'all. It's y'all's space.
Yeah, go for it if you want. If you're comfortable, we'll all take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah. So basically, Jeff Cope was dating a white girl while he was at Missouri, and coming to find out, her daddy was on the board of trustees at Missouri, and he didn't like them dating. And next thing you know, she said he raped her. I think that was Barry Odom, so he done the investigation and kicked him off the team. After the investigation was done, nothing was found. No, there was like nothing to the story. It was like a made up story from what I've been told and confirmed. And so that's when he got back on the team. So yeah, I mean, you take it with a grain of salt. like I said, it was confirmed by one.
Yeah,
Of the
those are things where it's touchy and
yeah, it's
kind
kind
of
of like it's iffy
it's
on. Yeah, so
yeah, it's dangerous to kind of to throw those kinds of things
So
out there.
you get where we're coming from earlier with not releasing that.
Yeah, no, and I mean, those are things where how some of these rumors get out there, and gosh, that's one where if it were, and if it has any legs behind it, you absolutely know there would be some college football reporters really hungry to kind of unearth that, especially those that aren't necessarily in the immediate, like, I could see, I mean, part of the problem, and this is just a general kind of macro complaint about the way sports media has to be. And I'm not blaming necessarily sports journalists completely for this, that it's a little bit more complicated than that, in that as the years have gone on, and this is something I'm not just saying this, without any basis. You talk to some of all the big time national college football reporters. I've had an opportunity to kind of just sit at bars and talk to some of them at the national championship and some other events. Over the years, things have gotten a lot tighter in terms of access. They're very good at gatekeeping within some of the university institutions. And so a lot of journalists get nervous about reporting about certain things because then they don't get access. If you're a beat reporter, you can suddenly lose access to a team. So that gets it dicey. So it's harder for some of these stories to come out. But at the same time, certain things are just so important, so big. But at the same time, I mean, gosh, it's part of the pop culture zeitgeist, if you talk about it. I mean, speaking of South Carolina, I mean, probably one of the best college football movies of all time was, of course, filmed there, The Program. And that was part of the story. If anyone watched The Program, you got the backup quarterback gets in trouble with the girl, and it's like the coach's, daughter or something. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's actually straight out of The Program. Now that I'd say it out loud. But at the same time, it's like, sometimes it may not be coming from the local beat reporter, but there's other reporters out there that'd be hungry to get that scoop that'll make their career. And that's one of those big ones where, if there's any veracity to it, you'd think it would get dug up. And now I'm not stupid enough to say that it would absolutely, and things always come out. But yeah, I get it. That's a tricky one, and one where, gosh, just as a person I am, I feel trouble trying to give that credence without a lot of substance, because that one, and I just wanted to say that because, and I get it. I'm not upset that you guys mentioned it, but I can see why. Especially, that's one of those things, especially that thrives on message boards.
Like we're coming up from the same page. Like, we didn't want to push rumor, but that's a rumor that is like really popping off in the message boards. So that if you're on a South Carolina message board, you've seen that rumor probably about 100 times now. If you just open any of our message boards, it's the first thing that pops up.
Which we're not saying it's 100% factual, but obviously you guys know where there's smoke, there's fire. So and
it could be all of it, and that's the thing. It could be so many other things as well. That's the thing I would just hesitate, because I mean, it's easy. That's always the classic problem. Message boards are easy to sort of let things loose. I mean, we know that. We help moderate the largest message board in college football.
Yeah, you're.
So I mean, we're not. Trust me, we get it. But it gets tricky, and I've always noticed, because I've been on fan boards before, with USC fan boards, things like that. So I know. I mean, the other USC. Sorry. But it's like, yeah, it's part and parcel with any major program, and it's tricky. But whatever it is, I hope it's not that severe. And if there is any truth to it, I hope we get to find out about it as time goes on.
It's just like the stories, like soccer, like kind of just like that's like the story that's grouping the South Carolina football world.
Yeah, and none of us want that to be true at all. Like,
no, I'm not saying that at all either.
Like Trajan Jeffcoat is. I want him to be enrolled at South Carolina tomorrow. I know it's not going to happen now, but like that, I wish that kid nothing but the best.
And sometimes players have it happen and it just goes away. I still remember. I don't know. It's so funny. I don't think Speaking of the Southern California, Mark Sanchez famously had an incident where he was accused, and it just kind of never went anywhere because it was a 1-to-1 accusation, and it never went anywhere. And then he ended up becoming the starting quarterback. Mr. Charming, and his career obviously is fine now, but that was publicized in the LA Times. I vividly remember when Mark Sanchez, as a backup quarterback, was just in a lot of heat over something like that. So sometimes these stories end up in those situations, and then they just kind of go away because there isn't enough to go off of, and then everyone's left wondering, well, what happened?
Yeah, I
But
never heard about the Sanchez thing, so I appreciate that.
Don't worry, you'll find it if you Google it. It
Well,
was LA Times. They're big enough. That's the nice thing about
I was
being in a
gonna
city
say
like LA. They have the ability to do that without losing access because it's still the LA Times.
exactly, I was the Eagles fan, so like Mark Sanchez came through the fold, and I understood Mark Sanchez, so I knew that happened, but I didn't understand it was him as a backup. Like,
Yeah, it was
I
still
had
him as
no
a
clue.
backup. Like it was a and if you know anything about the history of Arkansas football, it was when is the backup that's going to succeed John David Booty. Is it going to be Mark Sanchez or is it going to be Mitch Mustaine? That was when those two guys were
Holy
the
crap, I
that
forgot
was
that.
that was the
I
big
forget the
race. Like
fact
that
that
was
Mitch
like, is it going to
Mustaine-
be Mitch
I
Mustaine now?
completely forgot that.
I can't believe Mitch
That-
Mustaine
yeah.
got a documentary out of that, though.
Yeah, I felt bad for Mitch Mustaine. He did not complain and just went and became a tight end when they asked him to be a tight end. He offered to be a punter at one time when they needed a backup punter. And then like he got to start against Notre Dame one year and he actually played really well. And the game-winning throw, he did it, long bomb that was right in the hands of the receiver who proceeded to drop the game-winning touchdown. Like, I felt bad for him. I wondered if that game had gone any differently, would that have helped him to go there? But anyway, yeah. So, well, anyways, guys, it's been a little over an hour. This is typically when we wrap up. So I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping us up right now. I really appreciate our three Gamecock friends who joined us at the end. But on behalf of myself, Bob Ekayeri, on behalf of JD Moore, thank you all for joining us. We do these every Tuesday night, and hopefully now that I've got past my own little bout of COVID, we can start planning some guests again and filling those at other times during the week. So hope you all have a great rest of your week. Now I'm going to hang up and listen.